The tea service had been arranged with such precision that even the footman seemed afraid to breathe near it. 12 cups, bone china edged in gold that caught the candlelight of the Ashbourne drawing room, positioned along the sideboard in a line as orderly as a military formation. Each cup waited for its saucer. Each saucer held its spoon. And at the far end, separated from the others by exactly 2 inches, sat the cup that Harriet Crane had not touched. She was 22 years old and stood near the window with her hands clasped in front of her plain gray gown, watching her younger sister Cecily arrange herself among the assembled guests, like a flower deciding which way to face the sun. Cecily wore white muslin trimmed in pink ribbon. Cecily had ringlets. Cecily had dimples when she smiled, which she was doing now in the direction of the Earl of Stonebridge, who stood at the room's far end as though the polished floorboards between himself and everyone else constituted a sovereign border he had chosen to observe. Hugh Carraway, the Earl of Stonebridge, had arrived at Ashbourne Park 3 days ago to conduct business with their father, business that had something to do with the entail on the eastern acreage. And rather more to do, their mother had murmured over breakfast, with the question of which Crane daughter might suit him for a wife. He was 35, recently inherited, and said to be possessed of a fortune that could make a ruined family solvent within a single season. He was also said to be cold, deliberate, and disinclined toward sentiment of any kind. He had not yet spoken to Harriet. She had not expected him to. She was the sensible sister, the useful one, the one who kept the household accounts in a hand their father's solicitor called elegant, who read French without accent and managed the still-room and sat with their mother on the bad mornings and never asked for new gloves. The world had decided what Harriet Crane was, and it had decided it so thoroughly and for so long that Harriet had largely stopped disputing the verdict. She was the plain one, the capable one, the one you did not marry. It was their cousin Mrs. Fellows who said it first in the hall, 2 nights ago, in a voice pitched for her companion, but carrying rather further than intended. Such a practical creature, Mrs. Fellows had said. Harriet, I mean. Very useful to the family, I'm sure. Lord Stonebridge, of course, will want Cecily. Harriet had heard it from the staircase landing. She had stood very still and felt the words settle over her shoulders like a cloak she had been wearing for years, and had simply stopped noticing. The tea had been Cecily's idea, or rather their mother's idea executed through Cecily's enthusiasm. A small gathering, intimate and domestic, to allow the Earl to observe the family at their most graceful. Cecily had selected her gown for 3 days. Their mother had consulted the cook twice about the biscuits. Harriet had arranged the flowers, pressed the linens, coordinated the seating, written the notes to the neighbors, and spent no time at all considering what she would wear, because the gray gown was clean, and the blue one had a tear at the hem that she had not yet found occasion to mend. What she had not arranged was the tea itself. That task belonged to Milly, the housemaid who had served the family for 11 years and who was, this evening, sniffling with a cold so severe that her hands shook when she carried the pot. Harriet had watched Milly pour the first cup from her position near the window, had noted the tremor, had said nothing, and then had watched with a stillness that became something else entirely, as Milly set a cup before Cecily with a look of quiet bewilderment. Harriet crossed the room in 3 steps. She did it without thinking, without ceremony, without pausing to consider what anyone watching might make of it. She simply saw what she saw, and moved toward it. She lifted Cecily's cup from its saucer, turned to the sideboard, and in one unhurried motion exchanged it for the cup at the far end of the row. The cup that smelled faintly, unmistakably, of the valerian tincture their mother kept for her nerves. The valerian that was kept, Harriet knew, in a blue bottle on the stillroom shelf. The valerian that Milly, in her confusion and illness, had poured into exactly the wrong vessel. Cecily, who had been watching Lord Stonebridge and not watching Harriet, received her new cup with a bright smile and did not look at it. Their mother, occupied with the vicar's wife, did not notice. Mrs. Fellows noticed. Harriet could feel the woman's gaze on her back like the touch of a cold hand. What she did not notice, because she was setting the switched cup aside with the quiet efficiency of someone returning a library book to its correct shelf, was that Lord Stonebridge had been watching the entire exchange from his position at the room's far end. He had seen her move. He had seen the cup lifted, the exchange made, the cup set aside. He had seen her say nothing to anyone, return to her position near the window, and fold her hands in front of her gray gown, as though she had merely adjusted a vase. He said nothing that evening. He was a man who said very little in general. Something in the set of his face had shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the way that stone shifts when a crack appears that has been there for years, and one has simply never looked at the right angle before. If you have stayed this long, stay a little longer. She has not yet understood what she set in motion when she switched that cup. The morning after the tea, their mother received a note from Lord Stonebridge requesting permission to walk in the gardens with the family. It was a formal request, properly worded, addressed to their father. Their mother read it aloud at breakfast with the particular inflection of a woman who has been waiting for precisely this note and does not wish to appear to have been waiting for it. He says the family, their father observed over his newspaper. He says the family, their mother agreed, in a tone that meant Cecily. Harriet drank her own tea and said nothing. The gardens at Ashbourne Park were not large, but they were carefully kept, and Harriet knew them in the way one knows a piece of music played so many times that the fingers move without thought. She had planted the rose arbor 3 years ago. She had persuaded their father to restore the stone bench near the eastern wall. She walked these paths in the early mornings when the dew was still on the grass, and no one else was awake, and she knew where the ground dipped toward the pond, and where the old elm cast its shadow longest in the afternoon, and where you could stand on the terrace and see the whole spread of the park below, and feel, for just a moment, that the world was legible and sufficient. They walked in a loose group, their father and mother ahead with Mrs. Fellows, Cecily between them occasionally, Lord Stonebridge at the edge of the party. Harriet fell naturally to the back, which was where she generally fell, and walked with her eyes on the path and her mind on the accounts she had meant to finish that morning. She was not aware that Lord Stonebridge had adjusted his pace until he was walking beside her. He did not announce this. He simply was there, as a wall is there, solid and without explanation. She was conscious of him the way she might have been conscious of a change in the weather, a drop in temperature, or a shift in light. Something her body registered before her mind articulated it. "The rose arbor," he said. She looked up. They were approaching it from the south path. "Yes," she said. "It is well managed. The training on the upper runners was done by someone who knows what they are doing." She considered this for a moment. "I trained them myself. In spring, when the new growth was still green enough to bend." He looked at her then, briefly, the way a man looks at something he had not expected to find in a particular place. His eyes were gray, the color of rain on stone, and his face was composed in the manner of someone who has decided that the distance between expression and feeling is a distance worth maintaining. There was nothing in his face to read. There was nothing in his face to read. And yet the back of her neck warmed. "You manage the gardens," he said. It was not a question. "Among other things." The household accounts also, I am given to understand. She did not ask who had given him to understand this. She said, "Yes." He nodded, once, as though she had confirmed something he had already suspected. Then he fell back to his position at the edge of the party and said nothing more for the remainder of the walk. And Harriet told herself that the warmth at the back of her neck was the afternoon sun, which was entirely plausible and entirely untrue. The conversation she was not meant to overhear happened 4 days later. She was in the stillroom, checking the inventory she made each fortnight, when she heard Mrs. Fellows and her mother in the passage outside. The door was ajar, and the latch was old, the kind that did not quite close, and Harriet was not eavesdropping so much as present in the only way she knew how to be, which was quietly and in rooms where work needed doing. "Cecily is the obvious choice," Mrs. Fellows was saying. "She is charming and fresh and exactly what a man in his position requires. Harriet is a capable creature, I grant you, but she is not what he is looking for. She is more useful than decorative, and men of his rank do not marry their housekeepers." There was a pause. Harriet heard her mother say something low and indistinct. "She is the plain one," Mrs. Fellows said, with the precision of someone delivering a fact they consider to be settled. "Capable and plain. A man like Stonebridge wants a woman who will adorn his houses and provide him with heirs and reflect credit on his name. Harriet would manage his estate beautifully, and no one would know she was there." Harriet set down the inventory sheet. She set it down very carefully, because her hands had gone cold, and she was choosing, as she had chosen for 22 years, to absorb the verdict with composure rather than collapse. She stood in the stillroom for a moment after the voices moved away. She looked at the row of bottles on the shelf, the blue one among them that had caused all of this, and she felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, and was perhaps the specific feeling produced by knowing, precisely and completely, that the world has placed you in a category and intends to keep you there. She picked up the inventory sheet and went back to work. It was the children who changed everything, as children in this family had always had a tendency to do. Lord Stonebridge had a ward, his late brother's daughter, a girl of 7 named Charlotte, who had come to Ashbourne Park with the household in the tentative way of a child who has learned not to expect much from large houses and adults occupied with their own business. Harriet had noticed her on the second day, sitting alone in the garden with her knees drawn up and a book open on them that she was not reading. She had the look of a child who has been told to be good and has decided that being good means being invisible. Harriet knew the look. She had sat down beside her on the stone bench and said simply, "What are you reading?" Charlotte had looked up with the caution of someone expecting a correction and said, "Aesop. I have read this one before, though." "Which one?" "The Crow and the Pitcher, about filling it with pebbles to raise the water." "That is a good one," Harriet had said. "Do you want a different book?" Charlotte had wanted a different book. Harriet had gone to the library and returned with 2, and Charlotte had received them with the careful gravity of a child who does not cry, and they had sat together on the bench for an hour in the late afternoon light, without either of them feeling the need to explain themselves. She had not known Lord Stonebridge was in the doorway of the house until later. She did not know it now. She only knew that Charlotte came back the next day, and the day after that, and that the child had started to lose the look of careful invisibility and was beginning to leave her book on the bench when she went inside, as though she expected to come back and find it still there. The second afternoon, Charlotte came with a question about the Crow and the Pitcher, which was whether it was more honorable to be clever or to be strong, and Harriet had said she thought the Crow was both, which was why the story was remembered. Charlotte had considered this for some time with the particular solemn attention of a 7-year-old approaching a philosophical problem. Then she had said she thought strength without cleverness was brute labor, and cleverness without strength was merely decoration. Harriet had looked at her and said, "Yes, exactly that." Charlotte had gone pink with pleasure in the way of a child who has been correct about something and has not expected to be told so. She had pulled her shawl tighter against the afternoon chill and turned back to her book with the satisfied air of someone who has resolved a matter of some consequence. And Harriet had sat beside her and looked at the garden in the late light and felt, without any particular ceremony, that she was being trusted with something fragile and real. The afternoon it came undone was a Thursday. The gathering that evening was larger than the tea had been, a dinner party for 12 that their mother had organized with the focused intensity of a general deploying troops. Cecily wore gold muslin. The table was set with the silver that came out only for occasions of genuine consequence. Mrs. Fellows had brought her daughter Arabella, a handsome girl of 20 with excellent family connections and a manner of addressing the room that suggested she had been practicing. Lord Stonebridge sat to their mother's right. Cecily sat across from him. Harriet sat at the lower end of the table, near the vicar and his wife, and served as the quiet linchpin she always served as, the one who noted when the vicar's wine needed refreshing and prompted the shy young solicitor on her left with questions so that he did not have to sit in silence. She was doing this when she heard Mrs. Fellows, 3 seats away, say in the carrying voice she deployed when she wished to appear to be speaking only to her neighbor, "Of course, what Stonebridge needs is a woman of society. One who can manage a house in Mayfair as well as an estate. Harriet is very good with accounts, I am told, but then so is a steward." Laughter, small, contained. The kind of laughter that is not quite unkind, and is somehow worse for it. Harriet looked at her plate. She was aware, in the way one is aware of light changing, that Lord Stonebridge had gone very still at the head of the table. She did not look up to confirm it. She picked up her wine glass and set it down without drinking, and resumed her conversation with the solicitor as though the moment had not happened. The solicitor was a shy young man from Bristol named Mr. Garrick, who had come at their father's invitation and clearly wished he had not, and Harriet asked him about his work with the kind of genuine interest that was not, in her case, performance. He talked about property law with increasing animation, as he realized she understood what he was saying. And she asked the right questions, and by the end of the fish course, he had entirely forgotten to be nervous and was explaining the intricacies of an entail transfer with the enthusiasm of a man who has rarely been given the opportunity to speak about his subject to someone who grasped it. She listened. She watched his face relax by degrees. This was what she did, and she did it without thinking about it. And she did not know that the man at the head of the table, who had gone very still at Mrs. Fellows's remark, and had not unstiffened since, was also watching. She did not cry. She had not cried at this sort of thing since she was 16, and had decided that crying was a response that changed nothing and cost everything. What she did not know was that Charlotte, slipping down the stairs in her nightgown at an hour far past bedtime to retrieve the book she had left on the parlor chair, had also heard it, had stood in the passage with her bare feet on the cold floor and listened, and had understood not the politics of it, but the tone of it, which was the only thing one needed to understand. Charlotte went back upstairs. She said nothing. She picked up the book and sat with it in her lap in the dark of her room, not reading, just holding it, because it was the book that Harriet had chosen for her. The next morning was gray. A thin cold came in off the north, the kind that settled into stone walls and did not shift until midday. Harriet was in the library when Lord Stonebridge came in. She did not hear him at first, because she was on the library ladder, her back to the door, reshelving a stack of volumes their father had left on the reading table. She was aware of the door, and then aware of a stillness in the room that had not been there before. The quality of air in a space that has acquired a presence, and she turned on the ladder and found him standing 6 feet away, looking up at her with an expression she had no category for. She descended the ladder. She set the last book on the table. "Miss Crane," he said. "My lord." He did not speak immediately. This was, she had learned, his habit. He held words before releasing them, the way a careful man holds a lamp to check the wick before he lights it. The silence between them was not comfortable, and was also, somehow, not unkind. "Last night at dinner," he said. "Was a pleasant occasion," she said. "Mrs. Fellows made a remark. People frequently do." He studied her. His face was composed, the jaw set in its habitual stillness, but something in his eyes had a quality she could only describe as attentive, the focused attention of a man who has been watching a problem and has now decided to stop watching and begin. "You did not respond to it," he said. "I do not generally." "No," he said. "I have observed that." She looked at him steadily. He looked at her in return, and the space between them in the library, with its tall shelves and cold morning light and the smell of old paper and candle wax, had the quality of a room in which something was being decided. "My ward is attached to you," he said. "Charlotte is a very intelligent child," Harriet said. "She has a great deal to offer if people will make the effort to look." Something moved in his face. It moved the way water moves beneath ice when the temperature changes. Almost nothing, and then perceptible. "Yes," he said quietly. "She does." He turned, then, and left the library, and Harriet stood beside the reading table and looked at the stack of books she had not yet reshelved, and felt her heart doing something in her chest that had no sensible explanation. It was that evening, in her own room, that she learned about Edmund. Their mother came in after supper with the expression she wore when she had news and was not yet certain how to weight it, and she sat on the edge of Harriet's bed and said that Lord Stonebridge had that afternoon spoken privately with their father, and that what he had said concerned certain letters he had received before arriving at Ashbourne Park, letters from a party in London who had suggested, with great delicacy, that a young woman of good family and considerable practical intelligence might suit his requirements rather better than a young woman of merely decorative accomplishment, and that the party in question was his solicitor, who had corresponded at length with their own family solicitor about the Crane daughters. Their mother paused. Harriet waited. He had formed an opinion before he arrived, their mother said. About which daughter? Harriet looked at the window. Outside, the night was very still and very cold, and she could see the faint reflection of the candle on the glass. He has also spoken, their mother said more gently. Of Edmund. Edmund was the name Harriet did not know. Their mother explained it in pieces, the way one explains a thing that has been waiting in the dark for the right moment to be carried into the light. Edmund Carroway had been Lord Stonebridge's younger brother. He had been 29 years old and in command of a small estate in Derbyshire, and married to a gentlewoman named Frances when the fever came through in the spring of 1812. The fever had taken Frances. It had taken the child she was carrying. It had not taken Edmund, who had survived it and been left, in the particular way that survival can sometimes be the cruelest outcome, with Charlotte, who was 2 years old, and a grief so vast and so structurally altered his entire manner of moving through the world that he had become, in the years following, a man who kept an absolute interior quiet about anything that mattered to him. Edmund had died the following winter. a fall from a horse on a wet road. Quick. They said it was quick. Charlotte had come to Lord Stonebridge. The Earl had closed up his own heart around the keeping of her and the management of the estate, and the negotiation of an entail that had become, through a combination of poor investments and bad harvests, somewhat more complicated than it should have been. He had not, since Edmund, permitted himself anything that looked like want. Harriet sat with this for a long time after her mother left. She sat with it in the way that one sits with knowledge that does not change the facts of one's situation, and somehow changes everything about how those facts feel. She thought about Charlotte sitting on the bench with her knees drawn up. She thought about the cup of tea switched in a room full of people who were watching the wrong sister. She thought about the library this morning and the quality of the air in it, and the thing she had seen move in his face when she said that Charlotte had a great deal to offer if people would make the effort to look. She looked at the candle on her dressing table and made no decision, and felt something she could not name settle very quietly into the center of her chest. If you have stayed this close this long, then you know what she does not yet know. Stay. The following afternoon, she found Charlotte in the garden with a scraped hand and a story about climbing the stone wall she had been told 3 times not to climb, and Harriet said nothing about the wall. She found a clean cloth and cold water from the pump, and she sat with Charlotte on the bench and pressed the cloth to the scrape, and listened to the story of why the wall needed climbing, which involved a lost bird and a very convincing argument about moral obligation, and when Charlotte finished, she looked up at Harriet and said, quite directly, "Are you going to marry my guardian?" Harriet looked at the wall. "I do not know," she said. Charlotte considered this. "I think you should," she said. "He watches you when you are not looking." Harriet said nothing. She pressed the cloth more gently against Charlotte's hand and kept her eyes on the task. "He does that with things he is deciding about," Charlotte added. "He watched the East Field for 3 weeks before he decided to drain it." Harriet felt something in her throat that might, in a less composed woman, have become a laugh. "I shall take that as a recommendation," she said. What she did not say, and what Charlotte would not have understood, was that the East Field had been mentioned in the letter she had helped their father's solicitor draft 2 winters ago, regarding the flooding that turned good farmland to mud every 3rd year, and that the solution she had suggested was drainage, and that she had not known until this moment that anyone had acted on it. 3 things happened in the space of the next 48 hours. The first was that Mrs. Fellows, emboldened by what she had interpreted as the Earl's continued neutrality, said at breakfast in the presence of their father and the vicar, and both Crane daughters, that it seemed apparent Lord Stonebridge was conducting his visit very thoroughly before making his preference known, and that Cecily, who was looking especially well this morning, ought to take a turn about the park that afternoon, in the event that the Earl's business brought him that way. She said, with a smile that was entirely pleasant and entirely aimed, that Harriet need not trouble herself with the park, as she had quite enough to occupy her indoors. Their father looked up from his paper. Cecily looked at her plate. Harriet looked at Mrs. Fellows with the steady, unoffended attention of a woman who has been looked through for so long that the looking has stopped having any particular power over her. "Thank you," Harriet said, "for the suggestion." The second thing was that Charlotte came to find her in the library after luncheon with a crumpled note she had been composing since breakfast, which said, in uneven but careful letters, that Charlotte thought Harriet was the finest person she had ever known, and that she hoped very much that she would stay, and that the library was better since Harriet had reshelved everything because she could find books now. Harriet folded the note and put it in her pocket and said, "Thank you, Charlotte." Her voice was perfectly steady. Her hand in her pocket was not. The third thing was Lord Stonebridge. He came to the drawing room that evening when the others were at cards in the parlor, and he stood in the doorway for a moment in the way that he had stood in the library, as though confirming something before entering. The fire had been lit, and the room was warm, and Harriet was at the writing desk with the quarterly accounts her father had left in his characteristic state of comfortable disarray. "Miss Crane," he said. She set down her pen. She turned in the chair to face him. He came into the room. He did not sit. He stood near the fire with his hands at his sides, and he looked at her with the direct gray attention that she had been trying, unsuccessfully, not to think about. For 11 days. "You switched the cup," he said, "at the tea." "Yes," she said. "You said nothing to anyone." "It was a simple matter." "It was not a simple matter," he said. "Millie had been given the wrong bottle that morning, which I know because I looked into it afterward. If the cup had not been switched, Cecily would have drunk enough valerian to spend the next 3 hours insensible, and the evening in bed, on what my solicitor had advised me, without my knowledge, might prove to be a significant occasion. Millie was not negligent. She was unwell and confused, and the bottles were not adequately labeled, which is a failure of the still-room management, which you also oversee." Harriet looked at him steadily. "I had not yet had occasion to relabel them. I will do so tomorrow." "I know," he said. "You will. That is the sort of thing you do." He moved slightly, not closer, but as though the distance between them had altered in some way that had nothing to do with steps. "I spoke with your father this afternoon," he said. She waited. "I came to Ashbourne Park with a particular purpose," he said. "I had been advised, by parties whose judgment I respect, that this family contained a young woman whose qualities were of a specific kind. Practical. Steady. Possessed of a mind that works without requiring applause." He paused. "I was advised she was the elder Miss Crane. I formed my own assessment on arrival." Harriet said nothing. "Charlotte," he said, "has told me approximately 4 times in the past week that you are the finest person she has encountered. Charlotte does not say things she does not mean." "Charlotte is 7, Harriet said. "Her reference pool is limited." "Charlotte," he said, "is an excellent judge of character." The fire crackled in the grate. Outside the window the last of the day had gone, and the dark pressed against the glass, and the room was very quiet. "I am not," he said, "a man who finds this sort of thing easy to say." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the full weight of the attention she had been trying to classify since the first morning in the garden, and it was not, she understood now, the attention one pays to an account book or a field assessment or a problem requiring solution. It was the attention one pays to a person. The full, committed, irrevocable attention of a man who has finally stopped watching from a distance. "I am aware," she said carefully, "that I am not what most men in your position are looking for." "You are," he said, "exactly what I am looking for. I have been looking at nothing else for 11 days. He took one step toward her, then stopped himself, as though the habit of restraint ran too deep to override entirely. "I would not press you for an answer tonight. It is a significant question, and you have not yet had occasion to think it through fully. However," and here something shifted in his face, something spare and genuine, "I would ask that you do think it through." She looked at the fire. She looked at her hands on the arms of the chair. She thought about Edmund, whom she had never known, and Charlotte, whom she was beginning to. She thought about the Eastfield and the drainage she had recommended 2 winters ago, and about the cup on the sideboard switched in 3 seconds, with no one watching, except the man who had, it turned out, been watching everything. She thought about the garden walk, his voice careful and measured when he said the rose runners had been trained well. She thought about Charlotte's note, folded in her pocket still, the uneven letters. She thought about the way he had stood in the library doorway that morning with his hands at his sides and the full weight of his attention directed at her. And she thought about what it was to be seen, not by accident and not from pity, but deliberately over 11 days by a man who chose his seeing the way he chose everything, with deliberation and without apology. She thought about Edmund and the East Field and the miniature she had not yet asked about, and she thought that this was not a story she had expected to be in, and that she had never, in 22 years of being the useful one, allowed herself to want a particular story. She allowed herself now. "I do not need until tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. "I need," she said, approximately the time it takes to say yes. The quiet in the room that followed was the specific quiet of something completed, a held breath released, a question at last answered in the only voice that could answer it. He stood still for 1 moment longer, and then he crossed the room in 3 deliberate steps and took both her hands in his, and his hands were warm and steady and real, and he held them as carefully as something he intended to keep. "Harriet," he said, her name in his voice, quiet as the room. She looked up at him. He was close enough now that she could see the specific quality of the gray in his eyes, the set of a face that had been closed for years and was opening, with the particular slowness of something that has been shut a long time and is not entirely certain of the light. She did not move away. The scene in the parlor the following morning was conducted with the formal efficiency of a man who believes clarity is a courtesy. Lord Stonebridge spoke to their father privately at 9 o'clock. Their father emerged from the study with an expression that Harriet had only seen him wear at funerals and at the news of her brother's safe return from the peninsula, which was the expression of a man presented with an outcome too large for his ordinary features to contain. Their mother began to cry in the way she cried at Christmas. Cecily threw her arms around Harriet in the hall and said she had known for days and was not remotely surprised. And Harriet, who had been the elder, practical, useful sister for 22 years, stood in the hall with her arms around her younger sister and allowed herself, briefly, to be held. Mrs. Fellows arrived at 11. She had heard, she said, from the housekeeper, which in Ashbourne Park meant she had heard from everyone. She stood in the drawing-room doorway and looked at Harriet with the particular expression of a woman recalibrating a verdict she had considered final. And she said, with a smoothness that admitted no visible discomfort, that she had always known Harriet had qualities that set her apart. Harriet said, "Thank you, Mrs. Fellows." There was a silence in which both women understood each other perfectly, and neither said so. Charlotte appeared at Harriet's elbow at luncheon, not having been invited but also not having been excluded, and she sat beside her and ate her soup with great concentration, and then said in a conversational tone, "I told you he was watching you." "You did," Harriet agreed. "He watched the East Field for 3 weeks, Charlotte said. This was 11 days. She appeared to consider this a meaningful distinction. "You are better than a field." Lord Stonebridge, who was seated within hearing distance, did not look up from his wine. The corner of his mouth moved, a very slight movement, barely perceptible, and only to someone who had been watching his face long enough to know what nearly nothing looked like when it was actually something. Harriet watched it happen. She felt, quite quietly and without any audience, the specific warm certainty of a woman who has spent her life being the practical one, the capable one, the plain one who manages the stillroom and keeps the accounts, and has discovered that these qualities are not lesser things worn in place of more appealing ones, but the thing itself, the very thing, the sum of what she is, and that they are seen, clearly and completely, by a man who stopped searching for something else the moment he understood what he was looking at. There is a particular quality of winter light in the early mornings at Stonebridge Park, which Harriet would come to know as she came to know everything about that house, which is to say gradually and thoroughly, and in the manner of someone who intends to stay. The light comes through the east-facing windows of the library and falls in long strips across the carpet. The same carpet she had found Charlotte sitting on one January morning with a book spread open before her, and the cat she had been given at Christmas sleeping in the warmest square of sun. The wedding had been in November. Small, deliberate, at the parish church in the village, with their family and a handful of his. Charlotte had stood beside Harriet and held her hand during the service and at no point been told not to. The Eastfield had been drained by spring. The flooding that had turned good farmland to mud every third year did not come that year or the one following, and the yield from it was sufficient to make the entail, which had been the primary occasion of the visit to Ashbourne Park, a matter of comfortable resolution rather than pressing anxiety. The valerian bottles in the still-room had been relabeled within the week. Mrs. Fellows's cousin sent a letter of congratulation that was thoroughly warm and arrived 6 weeks after everyone else's, which Harriet chose to interpret generously. It was on a morning in the 2nd February. With the snow still on the ground outside and the fire lit in the library, and Charlotte asleep upstairs at an hour that was perhaps later than it ought to have been, that Harriet found the miniature on the library desk. She had not placed it there. She recognized it. She had seen it once, propped on the small table in her husband's dressing room, a little oval portrait in a worn gilt frame. The face in it young and gentle-eyed, and somewhat resembling Charlotte around the mouth. She had not asked about it then. She did not ask about it now. She set it upright on the desk, in the patch of winter light, where it would catch the morning properly. When her husband came into the library an hour later and found it there, he was still for a moment in the doorway. Then he came in, and he sat beside her at the desk, and he did not speak for a little while, and she did not require him to. She was reading a letter from her mother, and he was looking at the miniature in the light, and the fire was warm behind them, and outside the snow lay still and white and unbroken all the way to the edge of the east field that drained now, that yielded now, that had become, like everything else in this place, a thing that worked. He reached, without looking away from the miniature, and took her hand. She turned the page of her letter and let him hold it. The snow fell another inch that afternoon. Charlotte woke from her sleep and came downstairs in her shawl and found them there. And she stood in the doorway for a moment with her bare feet on the cold floor, the way she had stood in other doorways in other houses. And then she came in and curled herself into the chair nearest the fire and picked up her book and said nothing, because she was in a room where she did not need to. Thank you for staying until the end. If Harriet's story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. She would not have asked you to, but I will. The miniature remained on the library desk from that morning forward, in the patch of light where she had placed it. No one moved it. No one needed to explain why.